Informal logical fallacies are one of the most common mistakes people make when it comes to argumentations and debates.
That is literally a fallacy to suggest.
It's a textbook informal fallacies.
Okay, that's again faulty thinking.
A simple way of conceptualizing informal logical fallacies is to think about them as flaws or mistakes in the content or the context of an argument, if that makes sense.
Islam, like many other religions, is not common sense. Because, of course, homosexuality is perfectly natural. In all animal species, almost, it's natural. It occurs with a 10% frequency.
So, with time, we've come to realize that some people have or use tools that are not applicable to argumentations. And those are the things we called informal logical fallacies. So, a good example of this, other than the one we're going to discuss, which is the genetic fallacy, is something called an ad hominem attack. And an ad hominem attack is when a person attacks the person of the counter-argument and not the counter-argument itself, if that makes sense. So a good example of this is attacking Trump rather than attacking his arguments, for example.
You know, it's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
So now we move on to our main informal logical fallacy, which is the genetic fallacy. Now, as the name suggests, the genetic fallacy stipulates that one shouldn't take the validity or the falsehood of an argument based solely on its origins.
Why do you think religion came about then?
You can say that our wild ancestors were faced with terror, they were faced with ignorance, they didn't understand why things happened, they didn't understand why the crops failed, why there were plagues, why there were terrible diseases, why there were droughts and famines. And so it was natural for them to attribute those things to some kind of agency.
So we saw in the Richard Dawkin's example, he mentioned that religion arose as a result of ignorance and famine and all these things. And if we assume those things to be true, although they're not factually true, even then, that doesn't build the case for the validity or the falsehood of religion. So this is a typical example of the genetic fallacy in which Richard Dawkins, at least in this specific short video, argued against religion based solely on its origins, or argued for the falsehood of religion based only on its origins. And the opposite is true as well. You shouldn't argue for the truth of something based only on its origins. It should be within the context of other things, and that is the idea of the genetic fallacy. Now, the ill-defined idea of a religion in this specific context is something for another day, but let's just assume for the sake of argument we know what he means by religion. Another interesting scenario we can think about with regards to the genetic fallacy is when we conceptualize the inventions of the 20th century, for example. So what I mean by this is some people speculate that some 20th century inventions started out with ill-intended purposes. So let's imagine that the internet, also commonly known in the past as ARPANET, started out as an ill-intended military conquest project. Now, even if that statement is true in and of itself, that does not mean that the internet in its shape today is an ill-intended endeavor. So this example of 20th century inventions, or the scenario of the hypothetical internet, shows us that using the genetic fallacies in arguments is a poor way to argue for or against something. And really, the solution to the genetic fallacy is to contextualize it with other information. So the argument shouldn't be held true or false based only on one piece of information, which is the origins of it. But it should be within the context of the whole thing or other information that we can add on to the argument, let's say. And that becomes more and more clear as we gave the examples of the inventions, for example. If you've reached this far of watching the video, thank you very much for sticking out, and see you next time.